Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is Brian Stewart, who is one of the best foreign correspondents in television news for both the CBC in Canada and NBC in the States. He's reported from 10 war zones, from El Salvador to Afghanistan, and woke up the world to the catastrophic famine in Ethiopia. He has just written his memoirs of his life in journalism. Hi, Brian.
Hi there. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. The line is that journalists write the first rough draft of history. Is that how you see it?
In a way, I did see it, but I was very much aware you're writing often an inaccurate draft of history, or certainly a not full history. You realize that the ground is shifting underneath your feet. The landscape is changing all the time. Views are coming in, different experts back and forth. So any draft you're writing, you're very misled indeed if you don't realize this is an inept draft of history, but it's something to go on at least. It's something that the politicians, the diplomats, the historians that can work on. What was really happening at the moment of intervention? What was really going on when the things became a crisis, and a crisis became on the edge of a war and that. So there's a great responsibility to do the very best you can, not to inflame something, but to something that will not be a draft of history, but will be a grandfather of history or grandmother of history to some extent at least.
So hard to do, because I mean, you covered so many wars. You know, they talk about the line, the fog of war, but you know, there are lots of people who don't want you to know the truth, don't want you to know what's going on. It's so chaotic and confusing, so hard to pull it together and get any sense of it.
It is, and that's why you have to be really prepared before you go in anywhere. You have to have done your research very well. It helps if you know history a lot. What's one thing I always wish that fellow reporters would really concentrate on? Knowing history gives you some basis for understanding the situation. And the research is terribly important. You know you're going to be lied to all the time. You know you're going to be soft-soaped, to put it gently. And you know you're also going to be talked to by people who are desperate to get the truth out. And that truth is absolutely vital to the story and to the outcome of this particular crisis.
You always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. It's kind of adorable, the stories of you as a kid with, you know, Radio Free Brian. I mean, who grows up wanting to be a foreign correspondent?
I know, at 14 I write this essay, you know, when I grow up I would like to be a foreign correspondent. Then I wondered, well, why? I don't know. Well, the reason I always was interested in news because news was kind of sports coverage and the rest of it. But in England in school, in 1956, I was going to school in England. My parents were living over there. The Suez Crisis and the Hungarian uprising happened at the same time. And I was listening to shortwave radio and then watching the one or two channels there was on TV, and I said, there are people that get to go to these places, and I guess they're paid to go, and they get to sit at the ringside seat of history. And that so inspired me that I never wanted to do really anything else, which is good because it's probably the only thing I was any good at.
You started your career in Montreal as a newspaper man, and you talk about covering City Hall, and that kind of exposure to politics, and even on the small level, became a kind of microcosm to help you understand power, how things get done.
Enormously important. And I had in previous years when I would go to City Hall, and I'd try and, even as a student, we were said, go down to City Hall and sit in on things and see how things are done. I found that fabulous advice, because in the smallest city halls and local regional governments, you see all the dynamics of power, the games, the shifts, the mobilization of alliances and support. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful breeding ground. So I always tell students, for heaven's sakes, don't rush it too fast. Try and work a bit at a city hall, or work your way up in government before you get to Parliament. Because you'll see the same stuff is going on even in the United Nations when you go down there. That same human drama of working politics. So I loved it. I absolutely loved covering City Hall.
from politics, you moved, into television and became a foreign correspondent. And one of the, you were very thoughtful and reflective, even in your early days, about what your purpose was, that you wanted to bear witness.
Bear witness, yeah. I think around 72, after my mother died, I went to Europe to sort of visit her home, and I was living alone at the time, so it was me traveling across Europe. And I had two experiences. One was reading Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, about the vast number of millions who had died in the shadows, died with not even a name, a number tagged to their toe, that kind of death. And I got very interested in human rights and the knowledge that unless some kind of light is shone upon the gross offenses of the world, people do die in darkness and causes are lost. And I thought, journalism is like a poet in a way. Another thing that really impressed me was Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet who wrote in Witness. She was asked, standing in line outside a prison by one of the mothers coming to visit a son, can you even describe something like this? And she said, yes, I can. And then something like a smile passed across her face, the old woman's face. And I thought, yes, I think I can do that. I think I can be a witness. And when you suddenly feel that, you suddenly have a responsibility. So the responsibility sort of lay heavily with me from 1972 on. A wish to, if there are dark areas of the world, I want to go to them. If there are people suffering, if possible, I would like to show their plight to the world. That's something I can actually do.
I guess the most profound and famous example of you doing that is in Ethiopia, the mega famine of 1984. It's fine. I just rewatched your report and cried again. What you saw and what you had to tell the world, and you were almost alone there. Yes,
the CBC managed to get in because TV crews were barred from the north. And we went in there in September, in October, November of 1984. And what I saw, I thought I had prepared myself fully for this. I thought, I'll go in, it'll be really rough. I'll train myself to be able to handle it. I went in there and what we saw was like the world after an atomic apocalypse, a nuclear apocalypse. It was the landscape blown away by dust storms and drought. It was a huge movement of people along these dust-filled roads, cramming the gates of every town and city. And I said, either I'm back in the medieval world or the Black Death, or I'm seeing something that the world can't imagine. And all the time we're rolling with videotape, which is new kind of, and it brings the picture so lively to the audience. So we really fought hard to get that story out. And the BBC was the one other crew allowed in at the time. They got in for a day and a half. We were in for something like 8 weeks. And that was sort of 8 weeks of constantly going from famine camp to famine camp and seeing the first of the food arrive. And it was an event that shook me more than any other I'd ever seen and probably influenced me more than any other I've ever experienced.
Tell me about Burhan, the little girl.
Well, we drove in one morning, about the 5th day there, to a small Catholic feeding center in the north. And there were all these line of refugees ahead, and I said, it'll be another day of the dying or the near dying or the desperate. And it was overcrowded. There were all of these overcrowded. And I was going along the line, kneeling, interviewing these poor refugees through an interpreter. And out of my corner of my eye, I saw a girl flop onto the pavement. Very small, 3 years old, 2.5, 3 years old. And it seemed like her dad was there. So I turned around and I called to a nurse, please, nurse, come over. Do something for this girl. And they picked her up and they raced her into the feeding center's little medical area. And we ran in with them as well. The camera was rolling. And the nun that was there, a wonderful woman, but was saying, she won't survive. She will be dead within probably 15 minutes. She got pneumonia, it's in her lungs. So we're shooting this, filming this, and I said, oh my God, this is the end of the world. And I said, let's leave because I don't want to be here. I give her dignity in death. And we went off into this town, and nobody was talking because everybody was shaken to the core by this scene of this one girl's face captured everything we had seen. These desperate eyes, the final look of the world. We went and covered some funerals, and at the end of the day, we went back to cover her funeral because they buried people immediately in that kind of situation. And we got there, and we were walking into the camp. I saw this huddle of people, and there in the middle was a girl in the arms and she'd survived. They'd stuck a needle in her in the last minute just to see if anything could work, and it did work, and she survived. And we went back 3 weeks later, and we saw her, and I met her family, and we did a report on her that if she could survive, maybe the country can survive. She became a symbol of Ethiopia reviving somehow in that time. Years later, I started thinking, you know, I've always bothered by the fact that these children and families of Ethiopia, the world forgets them after the famine ends and whatever happened to their lives. So Tony Burman, whom you know, the great CBC producer, and I went back to Ethiopia to try and find this girl. And to our amazement, we actually did. I was going to do a story about the search goes on, or the never-ending search, or whatever happened. We did find her, and she was 4 years older, and she had survived. She looked even quite healthy, even though her family had gone through unbelievable hell. And I arranged support for her, and we're in touch to this day. You know?
You sent her to school, and
her siblings as well, her brother and sister. She had six brothers and sisters. So I said, this family has suffered more than enough. I don't want them to suffer anymore. And I'm not usually in favor of helping one particular person in a situation like that, because it's the whole you want to help, is you want to do the best you can. But they had gone through such hell on earth. And I said, there's no way I want them to suffer anymore. And also, she is a symbol to me of how a country can come back from death's experience, a near-death experience.
Well, and just to finish with Burhan, her face became the face, you know, shown on a screen at Live Aid, the Bob Geldof, you know, the huge concert. You know, you connected, she came to visit you in Canada. The two of you were on Oprah.
Went to Niagara Falls together.
It's an extraordinary story and connection.
We added her to her image of her dying face to a little strip of about 2 minutes of video to the Cars music, Who's Going to Take You Home Tonight? And it was played at Live Aid. And then until that moment, the donations had been coming in rather weekly. And once that was shown and her face was seen and there were other faces, the phones just melted. I mean, millions upon millions poured in. So we're in touch with her now. She's started her own charity in northern Ethiopia. She's married, has 2 kids of her own, and we're constantly emailing back and forth. It's quite remarkable.
Well, and I guess as you've witnessed it, I mean, you think you've seen in war and people's treatment of each other evil?
Very much so. Very much so. I've seen evil, but also I've seen moments of absolute greatness and human generosity, courage, the like of which you often don't run into in civilian life, but you do sometimes, but you often don't. Just amazing will to continue, will to help a neighbor, will to make sure that the poorest family down the road, a little bit poorer than you, still gets some food, a will to survive prison terms of 18, 25 years and such, and come out and start doing work for other people. It's for every evil, I'm going to attempt to say bastard, but evil soul I've met somebody who's near sainthood. And that's powerful.
How do you cover a war?
Well,
I mean, you've been, Beirut, El Salvador,
well,
10 war zones at least.
Every war is 10 war zones, but every war is very different. El Salvador was the worst horror in many ways I ever saw because it was the cruelest, most violent war of atrocity and massacre and just cruelty on a level I could not have imagined before, never really ran into afterwards. Beirut was a war in which people were thrown into this scene that somehow kept a great city great, even in the middle of the war. It was the weirdest thing. And in the Gulf War, which was a clash of giant armies, one way I cover it is I'm a bit of military buff, so I've always been interested in military affairs. So I can cover it both in the military sense, but also the human interest sense. So you're doing a mix of human interest, the military, the big picture, the small picture.
Well, you called the Gulf War a seminal moment in modern history. I mean, most people think of it as a blip.
Just a blip, yeah. It was a seminal moment because it went live on television. That was one of the reasons why. I mean, that was the first time where you really had reporters saying, come to me now, I'm going live. And also, it really was a case where had there not been an intervention to drive Iraq out of Kuwait, which held about 19% of the world's oil, there would have been a victory to the Iraq, Saddam Hussein, the dictator, that I think would have imperiled the entire world from that point on. And it got together an international coalition to drive him out. That was quite astonishing. The Middle East countries, Arab countries were involved. Something like, I forget what, it was 75 countries were involved in this. And I thought, this showed how the world could not let dictatorship win, could not let the big side beat the small side. And they put together an astonishing alliance. So.
Are you lucky to be alive, given where you went and what you did?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am actually, when I think about it. I don't have anything like the number. I have foreign correspondent friends who've had 10, 12, 15 near-death experiences. I would have, I would have given up long before that. But I've had about 5 or 6 where I realized if I just done something slightly differently, I'd be dead now. The funny thing is, it wasn't death that really scared me so much. And I used to call myself the last of the cowardly correspondents because I'm not a courageous person. I learned that being knocked out by a bull in Pamplona, Spain, that, wait a minute, there are limits to my courage. And in war, I was very limited in my courage, but I had to cover it. But I always feared kidnapping more than any single thing on earth. The thought and there was always a real risk that you'd run into a roadblock, and it would be a different roadblock this time, and you'd pull out a pass and they wouldn't recognize it. The next thing you know, you'd be chained to a radiator somewhere for the next 7 years or so. And those stories used to just petrify me. So when I went out in the field, I wasn't so much worried about being killed. I worried about falling into enemy hands or being kidnapped, if not by the enemy or a militia, a bandit group, a sort of mafia group, because crime is often very much a part of war scenarios as well. And that's become a real risk to reporters now, being kidnapped for money, because they know networks have the money and they'll pay. When they were kidnapping in my time, it wasn't so clear that networks were going to pay. I wasn't going to bet 7 years of my life on CBC's willingness to come through with $6 million for Brian's hide.
When you finally tossed your boots into the trash bin, I guess at the end of the Afghan war, after so many decades of working as a foreign correspondent, to be able to read and write, be more reflective. One of the things that was happening to you was serious burnout, almost, nervous breakdown.
It was a nervous breakdown. It actually was a nervous breakdown. I actually asked the psychiatrist later, is this what we used to call a nervous breakdown? He said, yes.
Because at first it seemed like you were having a stroke. You'd have these episodes.
Yeah. Clearly I was being affected by something very deep emotionally, and I was living happily with my wife Tina and daughter Katie in those years. And strangely enough, I started getting these stroke-like attacks that would really lose feeling in hands and face, and sort of like a panic attack, only infinitely worse. Anyways, I was hospitalized. I was treated by this wonderful psychiatrist, Anthony Feinstein. It turned out I had transference, And I had a nervous breakdown, but what was bothering me was not PTSD, because they treated me for PTSD, and I didn't have that. So what's left? And it turns out I had something that's now called moral injury, that correspondents or healthcare workers or soldiers or journalists certainly, who go to these places and see awful events happen, massacres, or see people dying, and they feel they could help, and they don't help because they've got a deadline to do, or they don't do something to help that they feel they could have. It's an injury to the soul, a wound to the soul that doesn't leave you, and years later it works on you. And I remember he asked me, is there any particular images that bothered you and haunted you? And I said, yes, I have nightmares sometimes about being in a car driving across Ethiopian landscape and passing a woman with 4 children, and then another woman with 4 children, 5. Men usually died first. And I said, you know, well, we could put them in the car and drive them the day and a half to the feeding center. And there's always, oh, well, we got to get on. We got equipment and all that. So you don't do things that you could do. Even if you did a lot of good things, they weren't always the good enough things. And that left you, or if you saw human beings treated in such a way that you should have stood up and screamed, you should have somehow intervened. And it's that wound that I think is the crippling one. And it's a little hard to treat, but you have to come to terms with the fact that you aren't God. You know, you aren't really capable of doing all the good that you want to do in these places. And there will always be, for every fine nurse in a situation like that, or a doctor, there will be people that you think you could have saved, but you won't get around to it, or you won't do it. And that's moral injury, and that's a real scourge of journalists today, who think, I'll probably get PTSD. Well, you don't get PTSD, but you get something else. PTSD is a sort of mental illness. The moral injury is a spiritual, if I could call it that, wound that stays there, and it can have these ferocious effects on you. I'm over it more or less now.
So you can get over it?
You can get over it. You have to really work at it. I did it in part by going back to Ethiopia a lot, and that's why I think a lot of soldiers want to go back to a war zone, and people who've been through horrible places, they want to go back to those because they want to come to terms with what did I do, and did I did the right thing, and was I honorable.
What are you most proud of?
Interesting. I would have normally maybe said something about Ethiopia, but I think the thing I'm proudest of is an accumulation of things that I'm proud of the fact that I was able to cover every kind of story. It is something that you can talk to everybody from a mass murderer to an astronaut, to a brilliant doctor, to a Nobel Peace Prize poet, to Mandela, to frightening Thatcher. It is something you can do every kind of story, from City Hall to the United Nations on the verge of a war. And that's what I'm most proud of, that there wasn't one area where I had to say to the bosses, I can't do this, I can't do a banking story. Well, you just do it because you throw yourself into it. That's probably what I'm most proud of.
Being a professional, doing the job.
That's the word, I guess. I didn't want to use it, but yes, being a professional is what I'm most proud of.
Final question. What does being Canadian mean to you?
I can remember, I think I said this accurate in saying this, the very first moment when Canadian patriotism hit me. I was a young kid, maybe 7 or 8, in Halifax in a cinema, Halifax, Nova Scotia, a kind of an overlooked city then, post-war, watching I think a British war movie about espionage at sea. And they were sailing across the storms and oh my gosh, the fogs, and oh my gosh, U-boats, the rest of it, all these perils. And at one stage, somebody on the bridge says, "Don't worry, we'll be in Canadian waters and in Halifax in 3 days." And the entire cinema broke into a pause. Everybody was cheering wildly. They mentioned us. They actually mentioned us. You know, my gosh, the city, the country, the purpose, our war effort. And I grew up as a generation, quite frankly, of Canadians who were resentful that their country was overlooked. It never got the full praise for what it was good at. But in that feeling of poignancy, you notice the lakes are better than anyone else's lakes. And my gosh, our forests are fabulous. And don't we do a wonderful job of bringing refugees and immigrants into Halifax Harbor and the rest of it. So you took strong pride in these Canadian things. But I always wanted to see Canada prove itself, and it has proven itself. So I'm very proud of the arc I followed from the post-war era, when Canada needs to become known better, to the point where it goes beyond the bronze medal country into great things being achieved, to becoming cool Canada in The Economist of all things, to becoming now a major country, and that's trying to sell it inwardly and outwardly is really what it means to me a lot, and why I love it so much.
Well, congratulations on a brilliant career, on getting your memoirs on paper, all those things. Lovely to talk to you,
Well,
Brian.
thank you. Very nice to talk to you.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Bryce and Nikki Douglas, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, the Linwood Family Foundation, Jim and Sandy Treliving, the Browning Watt Foundation, Richard Pilasoff, Michael McCain and family, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Mary Davey, Clinch House Foundation, Tony and Sherry Fell, the 63 Foundation, David and Cheryl Carr, the Sheila and David Wilson Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.